Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors of Strategy Page discuss current events with a splash of history. I'm Dan Masterson, host of Strategy Talk. With me today are Austin Bay and Al Noffi, both associate editors at strategypage.com. Dr. Noffi is the author of over 20 books, designer and researcher for multiple war games, and the author of our popular CIC section. Colonel Bay is an author, columnist, and military analyst. His latest book, Cocktails from Hell, 5 Complex Wars Shaping the 21st Century, is available on Amazon. Austin also blogs on Instapundit.com. Alan Austin, welcome this morning. Thought we'd do a extra strategy talk. We had an interesting incident in December where we had General Mattis resign. Al, this isn't the first time that American presidents have had problems with their generals, right?
Yes.
Dan, let's make a point there, though. General Mattis wasn't serving as a general. He was Secretary of Defense. He had a civilian slot. Now, that said, everybody thought of him as a general because That's what he was. I'm just making that so that somebody doesn't say he resigned as a military officer. He resigned as Secretary of Defense. It's just It's a technicality in this case because everybody knows Jim Mattis is a Marine general. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
And pretty much his generals there at the chiefs of staff were in line behind him and how he thought and what his thinking was. So
okay, I didn't mean to interrupt Al. I know
that's all right. Go ahead, Al.
That gives us a good intro. Of course, one of the president's main jobs is national security and national defense. And that means, especially in the past, he had to interact with the generals directly because the civilian apparatus of the defense establishment was extraordinarily small. It's only in the period since World War II that it's unusual to see a picture of the president sitting down and talking strategy with his generals. We certainly can think of it in pictures of Lincoln and FDR, for example. But way back in the early days, quite literally, it was the president issuing orders directly to people in the field, as during the War of 1812, for example.
Right. And Al, that was one of the reasons for that was unless there was a war going on, as in the Civil War, there was no War Department, right?
Well, there was a War Department, but it was very small. I think the War Department's total number of non-military personnel in the War Department at the beginning of the Civil War was maybe 100. Most of them were clerks administering this or administering that. But very early, there was basically the Secretary of War and a couple of assistants who are literally secretaries, and pretty much everything. In fact, the president and the Secretary of War signed commissions directly, right through to the Civil War, when it became a rather more difficult job to sign everybody's commissions instead. But going back to George Washington's day, I mean, when George Washington became president, the Army was barely 1,000 men. So it was pretty easy to sign 20 or 30 commissions, over the course of a couple of years. The first guy to give a president tsuris, to use the Yiddish phrase, was James Wilkinson. And it's a shame this guy isn't better known in American history. He was in the Army for a very long time. He marched with Montgomery as a young volunteer up to Quebec in the fall and winter of 1775, and then in the desperate battle for Quebec City on Christmas Eve, New Year's Eve, and ended the Revolutionary War with a brevet as a brigadier general. And of course, was then, since the Army was disbanded, he was tossed out on the street, so to speak. During the 1790s, he was involved in speculation in the West and made some contacts with the Spanish government of what is now Louisiana. And then when the quasi-war with France came up, he was brought back in the army and ended up as a brigadier general. Meanwhile, he was on the Spanish payroll. We don't actually know how many years he was on the Spanish payroll, but he was getting about $2,000 a year. Now that's 1790 something bucks. That was an extraordinary amount of money. And while you can't fault his personal courage, he was absolutely incompetent as a commander. After the quasi-war with France ended, George Washington apparently didn't have much use for him, but he had to give him a commission for the quasi-war. George was out of office at that time, was no longer president, but Congress had made him commander-in-chief of the army with Alexander Hamilton as his kind of chief of staff. So when the quasi-war ended and the army was disbanded, Wilkinson ended up as the senior officer in the U.S. Army, which was only a couple of thousand guys in those, by 1803. And he was in command when we took over Louisiana from the French. Because of his real estate connections and whatnot, he decided to build an army camp in this swamp that some friend of his owned, because it would help his friend make a few bucks. So about half the troops died of yellow fever and malaria and everything else. And he was in treasonous correspondence with the Spanish for more than a decade, at least as late as the War of 1812, which technically means he really was a traitor, since in 1812 the Spanish were allied with the British. Although we were kind of polite about not directly invading Florida, although since we weren't at war with Spain. And so he was several times court-martialed. Winfield Scott, who was a very young officer in those days, actually was court-martialed for saying that if he had one bullet left in a battle, he'd use it on Wilkinson. Called him an unprincipled imbecile. And John Randolph, because he's one of sort of the junior founders, the kinsman of President Jefferson, said from bark to bite, from bark to the very core, he's a villain. Amazingly, he never was convicted by court-martial. He was court-martialed several times. They never could pin anything on him. And he eventually, after bungling the invasion of Canada in 1813, he was put on a shelf. And although he kept trying to, he was involved in Burr's conspiracy too, although we don't know exactly what was going on there either.
This guy was a real treat.
Listen. Al says we don't know what was going on vis-a-vis Aaron Burr's conspiracy, but it was like maybe we're turning any claims to Florida or Louisiana, or he's selling it all to the Spaniards. It's unclear, but it's unsavory too.
Yeah.
That's the thing. Maybe that's the good word to use.
Why did Jefferson not just cashier him?
Well, it's very difficult. The early army was very political. I mean, that comment the other day, about whether there are Republican judges or Democratic judges. Well, they really were sort of Jeffersonian judges and Federalist judges. Generals, officers even. Even low-ranking officers. There was this, there was no formal process of, becoming an officer. So basically, you got somebody to approach the president, and he'd appoint you,
Well, look, Wilkinson was from Pennsylvania, and he was in Jefferson's party, the Democratic Republican Party? Is that the name of it?
I think it was Republican Democratic Party. But
I'm sorry, Republican Democrat. Okay, you know what I'm saying. I just flipped it. But he was regarded as a political supporter, and from a key state, Pennsylvania. But then, fine, he was regarded as that. It's still jaw-dropping that Thomas Jefferson didn't sack him for some of the things he did, and that James Madison didn't either. Now, this is something I happen to think, and if Al disagrees with it, he'll tell me, there was a shortage of individuals that would stand up, or perceived to be a shortage of individuals who could handle senior leadership positions in the American military, as small as it was. Now, that's a perception. I really don't think it was that short, but here's Wilkinson saying, "Hi, I'm a general."
Yeah, that's true. That's part of the problem. I mean, it was really OJT. And so he had come out of the Revolutionary War as a successful battalion commander with a brevet for a brigadier. And so when we need to, when we need to raise an army in the Quasi-War, he's an obvious candidate. And remember, you had to spread it out. I mean, today nobody really thinks about whether, on the promotion list, when the list of guys comes up for promotion to general, nobody thinks about, we need to have one guy from New York and one guy from, Montana. But in those days, they were really, the members of the congressional delegations would want to know why our state doesn't have a general or a colonel, depending on the size of the armies. And this guy, was politically well connected. God knows what he did with his money. But over the years, there's one estimate that the equivalent money he got from the Spanish is easily $12 million. In current day money, and that's at the lowest possible conversion rate. Because there's various ways of calculating that. Nobody knows what he did with his money. But he probably spread some of it around, to friends and relatives. I mean, if he gave somebody $100 in those days, that was more than a year's pay for the average American who was a working man, as opposed to a farmer. So that did that, and he apparently knew how to do the paperwork, and he did do some. Sounds crazy, but he did do some positive stuff. When the 7 Years' War ended. These things get really complicated sometimes. France ceded Louisiana to Spain. Now that the area between Spanish Mexico and French Louisiana, the territory in between, basically Texas, was almost totally unpopulated in those days. So neither country had paid much attention to delineating a boundary between the two territories. And then once the Spanish took over, of course, it became irrelevant as to whether there was a boundary. So when we buy Louisiana, suddenly the question of where's the boundary comes up, and there's various arguments back and forth. And Wilkinson...
Well, you need to say how the French got control of the mouth of the Mississippi River.
Well, basically, Napoleon swiped it from the Spanish by giving them Tuscany.
Okay, you got that, Dan? That they're trading Tuscany for Louisiana.
Yeah, and but the deal gets very complicated actually, because there was potential for war with the Spanish and French, but particularly the Spanish Louisianans, because under the agreement that Napoleon made with Spain, Spain would get first refusal if Napoleon chose to dispose of Louisiana. And not only did Napoleon not consult them in disposing of Louisiana, but he took back Tuscany. So that, believe it or not, I mean, this sounds totally crazy, Jefferson alerted the militia, using the Militia Act of 1795, alerted the militia in Tennessee, I think, and Ohio. I think Ohio was already a state. No, Ohio wasn't already a state. Tennessee and Kentucky for sure. But he alerted the militia for possible duty in Louisiana should armed resistance develop. Because the regular army was only like 4,000 or 5,000 guys, and at most you were going to get maybe a couple of hundred down to Louisiana when we took it over. But anyway, once we took it over, there was no resistance, and Wilkinson is appointed governor, and of course he kills off half his command. But he does negotiate a deal with the Spanish governor of Texas that they won't argue over the border, the disputed territory. What they could do is they made an agreement that both sides would patrol it so that there would be no, criminal gangs hanging out there and in case fugitive slaves were wandering around in the place. And that agreement lasted until 1812, the War of 1812, when, of course, with Spain on the other side on the British side, we decided we were going to occupy the area. And of all people, this gets really funny. Major Wollstonecraft. Major Wollstonecraft was the uncle of Mary Shelley, and he was an officer in the U.S. Army. And he actually was the guy who began, once the Mexican Revolution occurs at the same time that we go to war with Britain. So he moves into the disputed territory and basically establishes U.S. control. But anyway, so Wilkinson eventually, after bungling, is tossed out of the army. Frankly, the army, the army began the War of 1812 with too many old guys. I think the average age of generals was something like 60. And ended the war, the average age of the generals was something like 28. There were only 6 left. But he is, because of his correspondence with Spain during the War of 1812, he certainly qualifies as a traitor under the constitutional definition. People throw the word around all the time, of course, but under the constitutional definition, he was in collaboration with an enemy of the United States in time of war. And never got punished for it. I think it was Robert Leakey who wrote his epitaph. A man who never won a battle nor lost a court-martial.
Dan, let me talk
okay.
A couple of things on it. The takeaway here is that Jefferson saw him as something of a political asset, which is what Al said, given the way that politics, interstate politics in the United States existed at the time.
Yeah.
Also, when I said, what I describe him as, well, unscrupulous, unsavory, but he was extremely sneaky and very good at what I'll call narrative warfare, which Wilkinson was a one-man cocktail from hell. One of the things he tried to do, supposedly, even though Al, I don't think this ever pinned on him, was to get Kentucky to secede. Okay, right.
Yeah.
Yes. No. I know it's an it's an allegation. There's a story, and I read this a long time ago, but there are versions of it now you can find on the web. The Spaniards were sending him either 2,000 or 3,000 pieces of silver, whatever, and the messenger bringing it, and there were silver coins, was hijacked by some other criminals with him who happened to be Spaniards, and hijacked and murdered. And some of these guys were actually captured, but they couldn't be deposed because they didn't speak English. Yeah. And they're just these kind of weird stories. I think there's enough evidence for something like that, a close call where he would have been caught. Maybe one of the reasons he got away with what he got away with in Louisiana is because the Spaniards regarded him as their agent. That's possible. But after the War of 1812, and where he is dropped, you know where he goes and where he dies? Can you name it? Mexico City.
Mexico City, yes.
He dies in Mexico City.
Yes.
So why
he wangled a post as U.S. minister or something?
He's in Mexico City.
Yeah.
That's where he goes.
Yeah.
And one other conspiracy is that he told the Spanish that Lewis and Clark's expedition was underway,
yes.
and the Spaniards sent out patrols to try to intercept them and murder them.
Yes.
And it didn't happen, but that's really, maybe it's not treason in quote unquote time of war, but that's a hanging offense is what it is.
Well,
it's what he's done. So welcome to Mr. Wilkinson. Would you say there's friction between him and his presidents?
Yeah, that would be true. Well, let's fast forward a couple of decades and land in with Abraham Lincoln and George McClellan.
Okay, yeah, we'll sort of skip over, maybe go back some other time to Polk and his generals.
Right.
Yeah, because Lincoln and his generals is interesting. First of all, of course, the U.S. Army, only had 4 generals of the line, since technically speaking, the quartermaster general was literally a brigadier was ranked as a brigadier general, but only for the time he held that position. But there were only 4 generals of the line when the Civil War began, and 2 of them were older than the Constitution, General Scott and General Wool. And of course, General Scott was physically unfit to command the army, although there was nothing wrong with his brain. General Wool actually did command troops. He did rather well, considering the fact that he was in his 70s. And then the other 2 guys, I think the youngest of them had joined the army prior to the War of 1812. So, and there were only, I think, 4 guys in the entire country who commanded as many as 5,000 men. And of course, 2 of them were among the superannuated generals, and one of them was Albert Sidney Johnston, and the other was a guy who had risen to a division command during the Mexican War, and commanded quite a number of troops in the campaign. I can't think of his name now, as a volunteer officer. And actually, he did come back on duty during the Civil War, but he didn't do much. So you had to find generals in a hurry. And so in Lincoln's case, of course, there's the story that Robert E. Lee was offered command of the Union armies, which is not true. General Scott did offer him command of the army that was to be concentrated in Virginia. This is before Virginia secession, of course. And they sweetened the pot by promoting Lee to full colonel of the 2nd Cavalry Regiment. He'd only been lieutenant colonel. And he took he renewed his oath of allegiance while Fort Sumter was under blockade, and then resigned from the army after the firing on Fort Sumter. So technically, he violated his oath, even though he resigned from the army. The fact is, he resigned from the army after the war had begun. So that's sort of like George Patton deciding to join the Japanese army after Pearl Harbor. Well,
that isn't going to happen. That isn't going to happen with George.
That ain't going to happen, but it's true. And so you have to find generals. Now, who are you going to find? Well, you got some guys who are famous, so we'll pick them out. General Scott picked McDowell, since McDowell seemed to be a capable guy. The problem with McDowell was he was a capable guy, but he'd been sitting in his butt in the War Department for years and years and years. So that wasn't going to help. The other problem was that these guys' last combat experience, even the most experienced of them, was in Mexico. And the introduction, the rifle had begun to, be used in Mexico, but the mass use of rifles and more modern artillery and whatnot is going to change warfare tremendously, and there's going to be a lot of learning going on, and it's going to cost lives. So you end up, of course, Lincoln has to hand out generalships to the most able people. Benjamin Butler happens to be one of the most able people. I know, his reputation is in the pits, but if you look at what Ben Butler did in the first weeks of the war, you can't fault him. I mean, he managed the transfer of troops through Maryland to Washington, bypassing Baltimore. He then blockaded Baltimore, occupied the city without firing a shot because they were concerned there was rioting by working class Baltimoreans. And he got some of the first troops to Washington. He opened up the rail line eventually. He wasn't good at the higher, issues of commanding in battle, but he certainly knew how to manage some stuff. So you're going to give him a commission. In fact, I think he got the first. He may have gotten the first one. He certainly got one of the first major generalships handed out. Then you find the other senior officers getting the jobs done, and a guy like Butler is important because he's a Democrat. And in fact, he was a supporter of Jefferson Davis in the Democratic Convention and probably voted for Davis.
Look, Fremont, because he's a name, is brought in. As you're pointing out, it was kind of scattergun.
Yeah,
and in some ways you're just taking a shot on somebody's got a name, and because there are very few people with experience, and that's I think that Al's point here, Dan, is lost by a lot of historians because they look and say, okay, well, this guy never mounted up, this other guy never mounted up. Butler is regarded as a mediocrity, but he managed to stay in the war through most of the war, still commanding something, but he was somebody else's subordinate. Now we come to McClellan, and this is why was McClellan finally selected to lead the Army of the Potomac, Al? Why?
All right. McClellan had made a name for himself as an able officer. He actually served with Lee in Mexico. When Lee was going out on these patrols, like when he found the pass around the Mexican flank at Cerro Gordo, McClellan was there. So he was, he certainly was reasonably capable. And he'd also been one of the U.S. observers to the Crimean War and written an extensive report. So when once McDowell failed that first Bull Run, Scott picked him. Scott found him. He was very high ranking in his class. He was a boy genius. He was admitted to West Point at 15.
He was an intellectual, among other things, and he had some political talents, at least for schmoozing with senior political leaders. Now, that makes it sound negative, but he was good at that.
Yeah, and he had some minor successes, here and there in the war, so it looked good. Now, he was a brilliant organizer. He put together the Army of the Potomac in its basic structure that remained with some changes through the war. And he certainly had the ability to inspire the troops. I mean, it's rather amazing. The problem is I can't remember what general said it, but in order to be a great general, you have to destroy what you love. And he built this brilliant army, but he could never figure out how to use it, because how to use it would have meant committing it to be destroyed, committing your troops to be killed.
Let me put it in a way. This is there are things about McClellan, and I said here because most of my military experience, especially in reserves, was as a staff officer, and I did a lot of logistics. He was a very good logistician.
Yes.
But that goes into building the Army, but not wanting to risk it.
Yes.
That, I think, it is the way I would put it, and that's frustrating Lincoln immensely.
Yeah.
There's I think, Dan, is the friction point on it. And Al has much said that, but he's cut this. Yeah, and listen, by the time McClellan is putting this together, you're starting to already get the effects of Union manufacturing and manpower superiority.
Yes.
And he understands that. He's got that part down. But he doesn't want to get out there and tangle with Bobby Lee.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he's maneuvering. He gets. I mean, the Peninsula Campaign is this brilliant concept.
It's great. It's a great idea.
Yeah.
It's right in line with the Anaconda plan that Scott has too.
Yeah. And he gets within 6 miles of Richmond, and actually he probably could have taken Richmond if he hadn't been hoodwinked by Magruder in at Yorktown. Where Magruder put up this facade of extensive fortifications that when in fact there was virtually nothing blocking him, and he wasted a month trying to develop siege lines and whatnot to break through Magruder's defense line, and finally Magruder just was ordered out of it because sufficient army had concentrated around Richmond.
And Lincoln's perception of this, and he's not the only one. I mean, there's the Northern press on this, is that McClellan dawdled, and McClellan was still even though he was still remained popular because he was with a vast swath of the Union public, because he was intelligent and so politically adept, but he didn't push it. And so Lincoln's looking for somebody who will push it, but we have friction with the next guy who might have pushed it. I'm moving to Joe Hooker, Al. Yeah. So why don't you pick up on Hooker?
Well, Hooker took the army after Burnside had just really made a mess. Although Burnside, to be fair, when he was appointed to the job, said, he really didn't want to do this because he didn't think he was capable of doing it. And in fact, he was right. But what Hooker did was reorganized the army, developed an intelligence service, which had been hit and miss before that. He developed what would become actually an extraordinarily effective intelligence service that we're still trying to figure out, we're just beginning to learn how good it was. But Hooker's problems, well, he was arrogant, but then so was McClellan. He was kind of really outspoken about making jokes. I don't think he actually really wanted to become dictator, but he made a joke about it, which was not a good idea. He joked about it, I guess. And of course, Lincoln's comment was, you risk the battle and I'll risk the dictatorship, or something like that, And when he came to it, again, an extraordinarily able logistic manager, he made this brilliant plan for Chancellorsville, and in fact, the plan worked perfectly. In fact, it worked better than expected initially, because it turned out that part of Lee's army was down in eastern Virginia, down near Norfolk. A couple of divisions were down near Norfolk, so Lee's army was even weaker than expected. But the implementation of the plan didn't work out very well. There's several ways of looking at it. Jackson's famous counterattack, flanking attack, did unhinge the Union right, but within hours, a proper line had been established, and Lee was still enormously outnumbered, and his army now divided into three parts, and Hooker he was not wounded, but he was standing on a porch of a building there, and a shell hit the building, and he was knocked unconscious. He probably suffered a concussion, and nobody on his staff thought to notify the second in command and say that the general, is dazed and looks, doesn't look good.
He wasn't fit for duty, is what it was.
He was no longer fit for duty. Now, he when he came to, he clearly, he would later admit, he had lost his confidence. Meanwhile, of course, that meant that the army was now leaderless. And so they basically withdrew from the position when, in fact, it had suffered at most a local, in effect, a major but local tactical defeat, where in a situation where it still had enough resources to have gone back. So in a way, he was sort of just like McClellan. McClellan during the 7 days, McClellan tactically wins every one of those battles, more or less. But after every battle, he retreats.
Let's give, here's this is getting in the weeds a bit on this, but Hooker's probably in shock. I'd say highly likely.
Shocked and dazed and didn't quite know what to do, and so his commanders, of course, didn't quite know what to do.
Now, one of the things that I think we should bring out is that Lincoln is sending these guys letters directly and giving them, telling him what he didn't necessarily talk about troop dispositions and like that, but he talked about overall strategy that he wanted accomplished, right?
And he works in his political goals because, he's trying to keep the Union together. Think about that, guys. That's what it's going to take. Now, I'm sorry, Alan. I was going to make a point about something else going on. Look, here we're concentrating on the Army of the Potomac, and that's the critical theater. But what's going on that's where, Virginia's right on top of Washington. Yeah. But out west, you've got this guy named Ulysses S. Grant that starts taking it to the south. Fort Henry, Fort Donelson. It's not always, and then, Island Number 10 and all the going into the south.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. He's got, there's some defeats, or Shiloh, whatever Shiloh is, a massive bloodletting, but he stays at it. And there's another character working with him who has a national reputation for just being brilliant, even though he's also supposedly crazy, and that's William Tecumseh Sherman, who figures out, wait a minute, Grant knows how to lead large formations, and he understands what our situation is. He understands the economic component of how we've got to defeat the South. Remember, Sherman had been, one of his jobs is that he was president of whatever I think it was Louisiana Seminary, it was called, which was
Louisiana Military Cemetery.
Which becomes Louisiana State University, ultimately. I mean, he knew the South. One of his first deployments after West Point, it was in Georgia.
He knew Georgia better than the Confederates.
Yes, he knew, of course he did. And here's Sherman, who's okay. Whatever Ulysses' rep was, this guy can do it. And that's when we get back. He'll initiate, Dan, and this is something Lincoln knows he needs. I mean, talking about Grant, buy everybody a case of whatever he drinks. I like him. He fights.
Yeah. The other thing about Grant that's very important, Hooker, McClellan kept complaining about political interference in the army. Lincoln had to hand out generalships to certain people. Some people, were politically well connected. And so, like a guy like McClernand, who was a war Democrat, opposed abolition, but was extremely important because he was a Unionist. And McClellan or Hooker would give him an argument.
Well, in fact, Hooker resigns because he doesn't get the reinforcements he believes he needs before he meets Lee's troops.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, that's one of the parallels with, not that I would ever compare Hooker to General Mattis, Mattis being a much better man than Hooker, but that they finally get to a point where there's a dispute that they can't agree on or come to a compromise on, and Hooker walks away.
Yeah. You see, that is what an American military officer should do. That's the deal. If you can handle what the president is telling you to do or wants you to do, then you then resign. Don't go to the press either, But it's you do this. Look, Hooker was a good subordinate. Yes. Look what he does at Lookout Mountain. But Grant's in charge, and McClellan's problem is he's a logistician. And I'm using that as, if that sounds negative, I don't mean to sound negative. He's somebody that you need, building and supplying your armies, and then occasionally, as Al pointed out, he understands maneuvering and tactical engagement. But he didn't understand what Grant was supposed to have summed up, and this is according to Sherman, says, I'll take care of Bobby Lee while you basically slice through the South. He's going to sit there and hold Bobby Lee to Richmond, and then Sherman's going to go, tear up the South and tear it up economically, and then and we'll get this war over. That's a strategist who also understands what he's got to do tactically and operationally. So Lincoln finds his man, but his man. Here's the other thing too. Around July 4th, 1863, North gets two great victories, Gettysburg and also Vicksburg. And Gettysburg was a response to a Southern invasion. Nothing wrong with it. Lee made some terrible errors on this. And I'm not a Lee fan, as Al knows, for a lot of reasons, but here it is. While what goes on in Vicksburg, that's a Union offensive that has taken down, and Grant split the South in half. And the deal is, his greatest subordinate, Sherman, is sitting there saying, you showed me something. There's some good histories about that, about what Sherman going over to Grant after Grant's forces come from the around Vicksburg and come in and then close the siege. He writes over, congratulations, sir. And it's like, okay, now we got him.
Yeah.
And you see the difference on that? This is the man that Lincoln needed, and Lincoln had the smarts as president to say, all right, Ulysses, and then he makes him overall commander of the entire Union Army. But this is what Grant does. When he moves east, he takes over the Army of the Potomac. Meade's still supposedly the commander, but Ulysses S. Grant's running it, and he's got his number two, valiant number two, Sherman, out there running the Army of the West. And go at it, Sherman. They stayed in a pretty close contact. That's the military aspect of it. Lincoln had his team, and to his credit, he let these guys do it.
Well, we've run out of time.
Okay.
So I think what we'll do is we'll go ahead, Al.
Disagree with that, Al?
What I was going to add was the other thing that's really important is that Grant was willing to learn. And, if you read his memoirs, he's got an account of his first engagement in the war. And he's talking about how he's advancing on this position that is supposedly occupied by the Confederates. And he's basically almost literally saying, I'm getting like really nervous and upset and agonizing over this. And when he gets to the position, the Confederates have already left. And he says to himself, they were doing the same thing.
Yeah, no, I've read that. It's brilliant. Yeah. That's a great point, too, Al.
Yeah, he's learning. And if you think about it, he does make mistakes. There's no question about that.
Cold Harbor.
Yeah, but he doesn't make the same mistake twice.
Well, right. All right, Dan, I know we're running out of time.
I think what we'll do is we'll label this one part one, and we'll join up with you gentlemen later, and because there's some other interesting, especially the MacArthurs and their disputes with presidents that we need to cover.
Oh,
So
bring on Dugout Doug. Yeah,
right.
Okay.
Well, and his father wasn't
No.
much behind that. So
Al used the term arrogant to describe several.
right.
Yes.
We'll pick those up here in a bit, and we'll talk to you both next time.
Thanks, Dan.
Okay.
Bye.
Have a good day.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.